She was standing at the kitchen counter when her phone buzzed. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary Tuesday where nothing is supposed to go wrong. She had just poured her coffee. She hadn't even taken a sip yet. She picked up the phone and read the headline. 3 words stopped her cold. And in that moment, the woman who had spent the last 2 years of her life building something real with a man she genuinely loved had to make a decision, not the dramatic kind you see in movies, not the kind where somebody yells and somebody cries and a door slams. A quiet decision. The kind that happens somewhere deep inside a person before their face even moves. Before they even exhale. She set the phone down. She picked up her coffee. She took one slow sip. And she thought, okay. What do we do now? What happened next was not what anybody expected. Not the man who designed the test. Not the friends who watched it unfold. And certainly not the woman at the center of it. Because when a billionaire named Marcus Allen decided to stage his own financial collapse to find out whether the woman he loved was really in it for him, he got his answer. He just had no idea the answer was going to be about him. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from right now. We want to hear from you. And if you are new here, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Now let's go back to where this all began. Marcus Allen was born in 1969 on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where the winters were brutal and the options were limited. His father worked 2 jobs, overnight security at a warehouse and weekend deliveries for a bread company. His mother cleaned offices downtown 3 nights a week. They weren't poor in the way that makes the news. They were poor in the way that most working families are poor, quietly, persistently, with too many bills and not enough months. There was always food on the table. There was never quite enough of anything else. Marcus was the second of 3 children. He was not the loudest in the room or the most charming. But he was the most watchful. From the time he was 8 or 9 years old, he had this habit of sitting just outside conversations and listening, not eavesdropping, exactly, but absorbing. Taking things in. Cataloging them. His mother used to say that Marcus never forgot anything he saw. She meant it as a compliment. Later in life, he would understand it as both a gift and a problem. He got a partial scholarship to the University of Illinois at Chicago. He worked the rest of his way through with a job at a coffee shop and weekend shifts at a sports bar where he poured drinks for people who had the kind of money he was determined to one day have. Not because he was greedy. But because he had watched his father come home from the warehouse at 3 in the morning with his feet hurting and his spirit worn thin, and he had made himself a private promise on one of those nights, standing in the darkened hallway, watching his father eat cold soup at the kitchen table, that he would never let money have that kind of power over him. Over his family. Over his life. That promise became his engine. And Marcus Allen ran on that engine for the next 3 decades without slowing down once. He graduated with a finance degree and talked his way into a small private equity firm run by a man named Howard Graves, who saw something in Marcus that most people in that business didn't bother to look for: precision. Not just with numbers, but with people. Marcus could read a room. He could read a balance sheet. He could read the space between what someone said and what they meant. Howard promoted him 3 times in 5 years. By 31, Marcus had left to start his own fund with 2 partners and a shared office the size of a walk-in closet. By 38, he had bought out both partners. By 45, his firm managed assets across 4 continents. By 50, he had crossed the threshold that changes the way people look at you in a room, that invisible, uncomfortable threshold where the word wealthy stops applying and something larger, quieter, and lonelier takes its place. He had been married once. Her name was Patricia. They met in their late 20s, when Marcus was still building, still hungry, still the kind of man who called from pay phones because he didn't want to run up the phone bill. Patricia was warm and quick and she laughed at everything, even things that weren't funny. She had a way of making a room feel smaller in the good sense, more intimate, more human. For a few years, Marcus was as close to happy as he had ever allowed himself to be. But the building never stopped. The deals kept coming. The hours kept multiplying. And at some point, he couldn't have told you exactly when, Patricia stopped waiting up for him and started sleeping in the guest room and stopped laughing at things that weren't funny because there was nobody home to make her laugh. The divorce was finalized in 2008 during the financial collapse, which Marcus always noted with grim irony because that was the year he lost his marriage and made his fortune simultaneously. He had called that the worst good year of his life. He never quite got over it. What he carried out of that marriage, tucked under everything, never spoken about, carefully managed the way you manage a structural problem in a building you don't want to tear down, was a question. One question. Had Patricia loved Marcus, or had she loved the trajectory? Had she stayed as long as she did because of him, or because of what being with him meant? He would never fully know. And not knowing became its own kind of wound. It healed on the surface. Underneath, it never closed. He met Vanessa Cole in the spring of 2021. He was 51 years old. She was 43. The setting was a benefit dinner for a children's literacy foundation held at a hotel ballroom in downtown Chicago. These were the kind of events Marcus attended 4 or 5 times a year, not because he enjoyed them, but because his presence was expected and his check was needed. He had a system for these evenings. He arrived slightly late, spoke to 7 or 8 people, wrote the check, and left before dessert. He had been doing this so long that it required almost no thought. He could navigate an entire ballroom on autopilot while his mind was somewhere else entirely. On this particular evening, he was mentally reviewing a term sheet he needed to sign in the morning when he noticed a woman standing alone near a tall window at the far edge of the room. She wasn't working the room. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was looking out the window at the rain on the street below with an expression that Marcus could only describe, even years later, as privately content. Like someone who had just thought of something good and decided to keep it to herself. He walked over. He said something forgettable about the rain. She looked at him, not with the flash of recognition that usually arrived when people realized who he was, not with the calculated pivot toward conversation that he had learned to read in about half a second, but with the mild, genuine interest of someone who had just been interrupted from a pleasant thought and didn't entirely mind. She said her name was Vanessa. She said she was there with a colleague from the arts organization where she worked. She said the food looked better than last year's. And then she asked him what he did. Not in a leading way. Just, what do you do? The way you ask a person at a party. Marcus told her. She said that sounded complicated. He said it was, sometimes. She said, most things worth doing are. And then she turned back to the window for a moment, and he realized he had not introduced himself with his last name, and she had not asked. He stayed for dessert that night for the first time in years. They began seeing each other slowly, the way careful people do. Dinner once every 2 weeks. Then once a week. Then phone calls in the evenings. Vanessa was a senior curator at a mid-size contemporary arts organization in Chicago. She had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a high school principal and a nurse. She was divorced too, had been for 4 years, and she spoke about her marriage the way someone speaks about a chapter they have genuinely processed, with clarity and without bitterness. She had no children. She had a small apartment on the north side full of art books and a cat named Coltrane and a cooking habit that she described as aggressively mediocre. She made him laugh on their second date by burning pasta and calling it a character flaw she had accepted in herself. He told her later it was the first time he had genuinely laughed in months. What drew him in, and he knew this even at the time, even as it was happening, was the absence of performance. Vanessa had no interest in performing. She said what she thought. She said when she was tired. She said when something he mentioned didn't sit right with her, and she said it plainly, without softening it into a question or a suggestion. She was not impressed by the things that impressed most people in his world. When he finally showed her his apartment, 8 months into their relationship, she walked through it the way you walk through a museum. Respectful. Curious. But clearly not measuring herself against it. She picked up a small ceramic bowl he had on a shelf and asked who made it. He said he didn't know, he had bought it in Seoul on a work trip. She turned it over, looking at the base, and said, "Someone made this by hand. You can feel it." And she set it back on the shelf carefully. He watched that and thought, this is different. He wanted to believe it. He tried to believe it. But the question was still there. Still whispering. Still waiting. The thing that cracked the silence open was small, the way things that matter usually are. They were 9 months into the relationship. It was a Friday evening in January 2022, cold in the specific Chicago way that feels personal. They were at a restaurant, not extravagant by Marcus's standards, but good, the kind with low lighting and handwritten menus and a wine list that started at $90 a bottle. They were at the end of dinner. The conversation had moved through her week, through his week, through a documentary she had watched about land artists, through an argument she'd had with her board of directors about programming cuts. And then it turned, the way dinner conversations sometimes turn toward the end of a bottle of wine, to the topic of money. Not his money specifically. Just money. The idea of it. The comfort of it. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and swirled what was left in her glass and said, almost to herself more than to him, "I've gotten so used to a certain quality of life in the last year or so. I didn't even notice it happening. And now I think about what I'd do without it, and I can't picture it the same way I used to." She smiled faintly when she said it, not greedily, not calculatingly. The way a person smiles when they notice something about themselves they hadn't noticed before. She moved on. She asked about his meeting that morning. The conversation kept going. They paid the bill. They rode back to her apartment in his car, and he walked her to the door, and she kissed him on the cheek because she had a headache and was going to bed early, and he drove home through the cold streets of Chicago with those words turning slowly in his mind like a key in a lock that he hadn't meant to open. "I can't picture it the same way I used to." That sentence, innocent, offhand, spoken into a glass of wine on a Friday night, became the seed of everything that followed. He lay awake that night for a long time. The city hummed below the penthouse. He stared at the ceiling and let the question come back, full volume this time. Was it him? Or was it the life? And this time, rather than pushing the question down, he let himself ask the follow-up he had always been too careful to ask. How would you find out? How would you ever know for certain? By the time he fell asleep at 2 in the morning, he had the beginning of an answer. He took 3 weeks to think it through properly. This was how Marcus operated, not impulsively, but architecturally. He built things carefully before he moved. He thought through failure points. He modeled outcomes. He ran scenarios in his head the way his analysts ran projections on paper. The plan that took shape over those 3 weeks was precise. It was, in hindsight, also the most destructive thing he had ever designed. He called it privately, the reset. What it required was a convincing, staged financial collapse, the kind that would appear in the press, reach Vanessa naturally through news rather than from him, and create enough social and material reality around it that there would be no reason for her to doubt it. It needed to be real enough to test a genuine response, not a performed one. He spent those 3 weeks thinking about every angle. The legal exposure. The business relationships. The reputational risk. The people who might get caught in the edges of the lie. He built firewalls around all of it. He told no one. What he put in motion was this: through a series of carefully placed, anonymous tips to 2 small financial news blogs, a story began to build suggesting that Marcus Allen's flagship fund had suffered a catastrophic loss due to what the reports called internal mismanagement and possible regulatory exposure. The documents supporting this story were fabricated, convincingly, expensively, with the help of a former colleague who believed it was for a legal simulation exercise Marcus had told him he was running for a board training. The story was picked up by a regional business journal within a week. From there, it moved to local news. Marcus's phone began ringing. He answered calls from his attorney, from his CFO, from his oldest friend Ray, and from 2 board members, all of whom were told variations of, "I'm handling it," and, "It's more complicated than it looks right now." His legal team was informed it was a controlled exercise. His communications firm was deliberately left in the dark. Phase 2 was material. He moved out of the penthouse and into a 2-bedroom furnished rental on the north side that he had signed under a shell name. He bought a used Toyota Camry for cash. He discontinued the car service. He canceled the standing reservation at the restaurant where he and Vanessa regularly ate on Thursday evenings. He stopped wearing the watch. And then, on a cold Thursday night in early March of 2022, he sat across from Vanessa at a diner on Clark Street, a real diner, with a vinyl-topped counter and coffee in mugs with thick handles and menus that had pictures of the food, and he told her what he needed her to believe. His voice was steady. He had rehearsed it. He said, "Something happened with the fund. It's bad. I don't know yet how bad. But I've been advised to take certain steps while it gets sorted out, and that includes moving out of the apartment and simplifying things significantly. I don't want you to hear this from somewhere else. I wanted to tell you myself." He paused. He looked at her across the table. The diner smelled like coffee and something frying in a pan. "I may have lost most of it," he said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that." There was a long silence. Not uncomfortable, just long. Vanessa held her coffee mug in both hands. She was looking at the table, then at him. Then at the table again. And then she looked up, and her eyes were clear and direct, and she said, "Okay. So what do you need right now? Not what does this mean for us? Not what are we going to do? Not are you going to be okay," spoken in the coded way that question is sometimes asked, where what it really means is, "Am I going to be okay?" Just, what do you need? Right now. From me. Tonight. Marcus sat with that for the rest of the evening. And he told himself it was just the first response. That the test was still ahead. That the real character of a person doesn't show in the first moment but in the weeks that follow. He told himself that, and he believed it, and he drove home to the rental apartment with its parking lot view and he sat in the unfamiliar silence and he waited. The weeks that followed were not what Marcus had modeled. He had designed this test the way he designed financial stress tests. He had imagined specific outcomes and assigned probabilities to them. The highest probability outcome, the one he had privately bet on, was a gradual withdrawal. Not dramatic abandonment. He didn't think Vanessa was that kind of woman. But a slow cooling. Shorter calls. Lighter presence. The natural recalibration of someone who had realized the math of the relationship had changed and was quietly adjusting her position. The second scenario he had imagined was anger, the honest kind, where she would say directly that this was not what she had signed up for, and she would leave with her dignity intact. He had actually respected that scenario in his planning. He had almost hoped for it, in some quiet corner of himself, because at least it would have been honest. What he did not model, what he had not assigned any probability to whatsoever, was what actually happened. Vanessa showed up. Not once. Not twice. Consistently. Quietly. Without ceremony. She showed up the way people who have actually lived through hard times show up for each other, not with drama, but with presence. On the second Tuesday after he told her, she came to the rental apartment with groceries. Not a lavish spread. Just groceries. She put them on the counter and started cooking in the small kitchen, and the apartment filled with the smell of garlic and onion and something warming on the stove, and Marcus sat at the kitchen table pretending to read documents and watching her from behind the papers and feeling something shift in his chest that he didn't immediately have a word for. She hummed to herself while she cooked. Not a recognizable song, just a quiet, private sound. The kind of sound a person makes when they are comfortable somewhere. When they are not performing. She set a plate in front of him and sat across from him with her own plate and talked about her week, a junior staff member who was struggling, an installation she was behind on planning, and she didn't bring up his situation, and she didn't avoid it either. She was just there. The way people used to be there for each other, back when presence was the whole point. Over the following 2 weeks, Marcus kept his mental log going. Day 15, she called in the evening to check in, the way she always had, no change in frequency or warmth. Day 17, she suggested they take a walk on Saturday rather than going out, framing it as something she had been wanting to do more of anyway. Day 19, she arrived at the apartment with a book she thought he'd like, a biography of a man who had rebuilt after complete financial ruin, which she handed to him with such genuine thoughtfulness that Marcus had to look away for a moment to collect himself. Day 22, he noticed she had quietly begun referring to things in the future tense, when things settle, by the summer, eventually, and she said these things as though she had no doubt there was a future to refer to. As though that part was simply not in question. He began sleeping badly again. Not because of the test. Because of what the test was showing him, and what it was doing to him to watch it happen. The hardest moment came on a Sunday afternoon, 29 days into the test. Marcus was at the rental apartment alone when his phone rang. It was Ray, his oldest friend, the one who had known him since the South Side, the one who had been in his wedding and held his hand through his divorce and had never once in 30 years told Marcus Allen what he wanted to hear if it wasn't the truth. Ray had been watching the story play out in the press. He had called several times. Marcus had given him the same managed response he had given everyone else. But on this Sunday afternoon, Ray didn't lead with questions about the fund or the legal situation. He said, "I've been watching Vanessa." A pause. "I've been watching how she's been since all this started. I've been asking around. I had lunch with Carol from your office last week, and she ran into Vanessa, and she told me something." Marcus went still. Ray said, "She told me Vanessa has been telling people she's not going anywhere. Not in a performative way. In the way where it's just obvious. Like it isn't even a question for her. You understand what I'm telling you?" Marcus said he understood. Ray said, "I also want to tell you something else, and I need you to hear it." A pause again. Then, "You are a fool, Marcus. Whatever you think you're doing, you are a damn fool, and I hope it doesn't cost you the best thing that's happened to you in 20 years. And then Ray hung up. Marcus sat in the rental apartment for a long time after that call. The afternoon light moved across the parking lot view. He could hear someone's television through the thin wall. He thought about Ray standing at a payphone on the South Side, age 16, calling his mother to say he would be late, while Marcus waited outside on the sidewalk in the cold. He thought about Patricia eating cold cereal alone in the big kitchen of the house they had shared, in the months before she finally left. He thought about Vanessa setting the ceramic bowl back on his shelf carefully. About her asking what he needed before she asked anything else. About the way she hummed to herself while she cooked in a kitchen that wasn't hers, in an apartment that smelled like someone else's life, for a man she believed had lost everything. And for the first time since he had started all of this, Marcus Allen felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Not guilt, though the guilt was there too. Something underneath the guilt. Something older and more fundamental. He felt ashamed. The real kind. The kind that doesn't need an audience. The kind that sits in you quietly and tells you exactly who you have been. He almost called her that night. He picked up his phone 3 times. He set it back down each time. He told himself he needed to see it through. He told himself he needed to know. But the truth he wasn't ready to say out loud yet, not even to himself, was that he already knew. He had known for at least 10 days. He just wasn't ready to face what knowing meant. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this story all the way through. Because what happens next is where everything falls apart, and then, slowly, impossibly, begins to come back together. The breaking point arrived on a Saturday afternoon, 37 days into the test. Marcus was at the apartment when Vanessa showed up at the door unannounced. She had her coat on and a reusable grocery bag in one hand and her keys in the other, and the moment Marcus saw her face he knew something was different. She looked like she had been crying, recently, quietly, the kind of crying that doesn't leave a mess, just a rawness around the eyes and a particular stillness in the jaw. She came inside without saying anything right away. She put the bag on the kitchen counter. She sat down at the table. She didn't take her coat off. She looked at her hands for a moment, and then she looked at him, and she said, "I need to tell you something. And I need you to just listen before you say anything." Marcus sat down across from her. He nodded. She had been offered a position. A senior curatorial role at a major arts institution in Boston, one she had been circling for years, one that represented the kind of professional step that comes once in a career if you're lucky. The offer had arrived through her network 3 weeks earlier, completely unrelated to Marcus or anything in his world, the result of a relationship she had been building professionally for 6 or 7 years. She had been sitting on it for 3 weeks without saying anything because she hadn't wanted to bring her own good news into what she believed was his crisis. But the deadline for her response was in 48 hours, and she had already made her decision. She had turned it down. She said it plainly. She said, "I wasn't going to leave while you're going through this. Not because I think I owe you anything. But because I know what I feel, and what I feel told me to stay. And I'm not the kind of person who runs towards something good for herself when someone she cares about is in the middle of something hard." She paused. She finally took off her coat. She said, "I know we've never formally defined what we are. I know that conversation is one we keep moving around. But I thought you should know where I stand. And I thought you should hear it from me before the deadline passed, so you didn't think I was making some quiet sacrifice that you never knew about." She looked at him very directly. "I'm not a sacrifice person. I made a choice. And I just wanted you to know what it was." The room was completely silent. Marcus could hear the refrigerator. He could hear the television through the wall again. He could feel the 37 days of manufactured crisis pressing down on him with a weight he had not prepared for. And underneath that weight, something had broken clean open, something he had spent 2 years, and really 20 years before that, keeping carefully sealed. He looked at this woman who had turned down the best professional opportunity of her career for a version of him that had never existed. For a lie he had constructed. For a test she did not know she was taking. And Marcus Allen, who had sat across from some of the most powerful people in American finance and never once flinched, felt his throat close. He said, "Vanessa, I have to tell you something." And he heard, from very far inside himself, the sound of a door opening. He told her everything. He did not soften it. He did not build toward it slowly or frame it carefully or manage the narrative the way he had managed every narrative for 30 years. He laid it out the way you lay something down when you have been carrying it too long and your arms have finally given out, abruptly, completely, with relief and with horror in equal measure. The blogs. The documents. The fabricated collapse. The Camry. The apartment. The deleted dinner reservations. The watch. All of it. He told her why. He told her about the question that had followed him out of his first marriage. He told her about Patricia. He told her about the thing Vanessa had said at dinner in January, the line about the quality of life, and how it had triggered something in him he hadn't known how to manage any other way. He told her it was wrong. He didn't add anything after that. He just said it was wrong, and he stopped talking, and he waited. The silence lasted a very long time. He watched her face move through something he could not fully interpret. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She went very still, the way a person goes still when they are processing something so large that the body needs to pause everything else while the mind catches up. Then she stood. She picked up her coat and her bag. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the frame and she turned and looked at him. And what he saw on her face was not what he expected. It wasn't rage. It wasn't contempt. It was grief. The specific grief of a person who has just discovered that the thing they were building was constructed on ground that was never level. She said, very quietly, "I turned down Boston for a lie." And then she walked out. He didn't follow her. He knew, with the same precision he applied to everything else in his life, that following her right then would have been the worst possible thing he could do. So he sat in the rental apartment, in the silence, while the afternoon turned to evening outside the parking lot window. And he let himself feel what he had spent 37 days, 37 carefully designed days, building toward. He let himself feel all of it. The shame. The loss. The specific, surgical grief of a man who had tried to protect himself from being hurt and had hurt the one person who deserved it least. The silence that followed lasted 10 days. 10 days during which Marcus Allen, a man who had navigated financial crises, hostile acquisitions, regulatory investigations, and the slow unraveling of his first marriage, could not figure out what to do with himself. He kept the rental apartment even though there was no longer any reason to be there. He didn't call her. He picked up his phone 100 times and set it back down. He drove the Camry to and from his real office, where the staged collapse had been quietly unwound and his staff was being briefed that the drill was over, and he sat through meetings and reviewed documents and signed off on decisions and felt, underneath all of it, as hollow as he had ever felt in his life. On day 4 of the silence, he went to see Ray. He drove to the south side on a Sunday morning and knocked on Ray's door, which is something he had not done in years, shown up without calling first, like they used to when they were young. Ray opened the door, looked at him, and said, "You told her." Marcus said yes. Ray said, "Come in." They sat in Ray's kitchen, which smelled like coffee and his wife's cooking from the night before, and Marcus told Ray everything. Ray listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When Marcus finished, Ray sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know what your problem is? You've spent your whole life testing things before you commit to them. Your deals, your partnerships, your investments. You test everything to death before you put your name on it. And somewhere along the way, you started doing the same thing with people." He looked at Marcus directly. "People aren't investments, Marcus. You can't stress test a person into being trustworthy. Trust is the thing you do before you have proof. That's the whole point of it." Marcus said nothing. Ray said, "Go fix it." Marcus said he didn't know if it could be fixed. Ray said, "Then be honest about that too." Marcus drove back to the rental apartment through the familiar streets of his childhood and thought about what Ray had said all the way home. He thought about the word trust. Not as a financial concept, not as counterparty reliability or contractual obligation, but in its original, human meaning. Trust as a decision made in the absence of certainty. Trust as the deliberate act of exposure. The willingness to be seen without a guarantee of safety. He thought about the fact that he had spent his entire adult life building systems to avoid exactly that exposure. And he thought about Vanessa Cole, who had walked into his life and trusted him, without a test, without a system, without a structure, and who had paid for that trust with 37 days of grief and a career opportunity she had quietly sacrificed without even telling him. On day 8 of the silence, he sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and he wrote. Not an email, he knew an email was too easy, too editable, too managed. Not a text. He wrote a letter. He wrote 4 pages by hand, which took him 3 hours because he kept stopping and rewriting parts and crossing things out and starting again. He wrote about Patricia and the question she had left him with. He wrote about Howard Graves and the copy shop and the South Side and his father eating cold soup at 3 in the morning. He wrote about the first night he met Vanessa at the benefit dinner and the window and the rain on the street. He wrote about the ceramic bowl and what she had said about the hands that made it. He wrote about the January dinner and the line about the quality of life, and he wrote about how he had heard that sentence and what it had done to him. He wrote about Ray's phone call and about sitting in the apartment on that Sunday afternoon and feeling the shame. He wrote about Boston. He did not ask her to come back. He did not request anything. He explained and he apologized and he was honest, the bare, unguarded, not carefully managed kind of honest that he had spent his whole adult life avoiding. He folded the letter. He sealed it. He had it hand-delivered to her office. She called him on day 11. He was in his real office, the actual penthouse, which he had returned to when the fiction was officially unwound, when his phone buzzed and her name appeared on the screen. He answered on the second ring. She said, "I read your letter." He said, "I know it's not enough." She said, "No, it's not." A pause. He didn't fill it. She said, "I want you to understand what those 37 days were like for me. Not the material part. I've been genuinely poor before, in my 20s, and it wasn't pleasant but it wasn't catastrophic. I don't mean that. I mean the emotional part. Watching you go through what I believed was real suffering. Sitting with you in that apartment. Making dinner in that kitchen. Turning down Boston. All of it, while you sat across from me taking notes in your head like I was a case study." A long pause. "That's the part that's hard to get past. Not that you doubted me. That you let me grieve for you while you were fine. You let me sacrifice for nothing." Her voice was calm the whole time. It never cracked. That steadiness was, somehow, more affecting than tears would have been. Marcus said, "You're right. I have no answer to that except that you're right." She said, "I know." Another pause. Then she said, "Tell me something. If I had left, if I had started to pull away in the first week or two, would you have told me the truth then? Or would you have let me go?" He sat with that question for a moment. He said, "I would like to tell you I would have told you the truth. I'm not sure that's honest." She said, "Okay. At least that's honest." And they talked for 2 hours. That call was not a reconciliation. It was a beginning. Not of the relationship that had existed before. That version was over, dismantled by 37 days of lies and one devastating revelation. But a beginning of something else. Something that could only start from that exact conversation, at that exact level of exposure, with both of them standing in the wreckage of what had been and deciding, separately, individually, with no guarantee of outcome, whether there was anything worth trying to build in its place. What happened over the next 4 months was not a romantic comedy resolution. There were no grand gestures. No dramatic reunions in airports. No slow walks through autumn leaves with a swelling orchestral score. What there was, instead, was conversation. The kind that most couples spend entire relationships avoiding. They met twice a week at first, always somewhere neutral, always somewhere without history or weight attached to it, always somewhere they had never been together before. A coffee shop near her apartment. A park bench along the lakefront. A small Thai restaurant on the north side that neither of them had ever visited. And they talked. They talked about the marriage they had each come from and what they had each brought out of it. They talked about money and what it meant to each of them, not abstractly but specifically, in the rooted, personal way that money always means something personal. They talked about fear. Marcus talked about fear more in those 4 months than he had talked about it in his entire previous life combined. He told her about the boy in the hallway watching his father eat cold soup. He told her about the moment in his late 30s when he had finally crossed the threshold he had always been building toward, and had stood on the other side of it and felt, unexpectedly, more afraid than before. He told her that the higher he went, the more it seemed like everything could disappear, not the money, but everything else. The realness. The connections. The ability to know what was true. She listened to all of it. She did not rush to reassure him. She did not tell him his fear was irrational or that he had nothing to worry about. She just listened, which is what he needed more than any reassurance could have provided. Vanessa, for her part, told him things she had not told anyone. She told him about her marriage, more than she had shared before. Her ex-husband had been a decent man, she said. A genuinely decent man. But she had been with him for 11 years and she had never, not once in those 11 years, felt fully seen. She had felt cared for. She had felt provided for, in certain ways. She had felt comfortable. But seen, actually known, in the way you want to be known by the person who shares your life, no. And she said she had thought, when she met Marcus, that he was different. That the precision with which he paid attention to things, to the bowl from Seoul, to the things she said, to the way she moved through a room, meant that he was capable of the kind of seeing she had been looking for. And then she said, the test showed me that I was right about your capacity to see. And wrong about whether you trusted yourself enough to let me see you. She paused. That's the part I'm still working through. Marcus said, what would help? She said, stop managing the outcome. Of us. Of everything. Just, stop trying to control what I discover about you. And let me discover it. It was in the third month of those conversations that something genuinely shifted. They were sitting on the lakefront bench in early September, the air already carrying the first suggestion of fall, when Marcus said something that surprised even him as it came out. He said, I think I've been afraid of this my whole life. She said, of what? He said, of being ordinary to someone. Of being the man without the penthouse and without the firm and without the watch, and having someone look at me like that's fine. Like I'm enough. Because if that's possible, then I've been wrong about almost everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Marcus. You were enough in that rental apartment with the parking lot view. You were enough every single night when you were pretending to lose everything. You just weren't watching the right thing. He looked at her. She said, you were watching me for evidence that I would leave. But I was watching you for evidence that you'd let me stay. And I kept waiting for you to let me in. And you never did. He said, quietly, I'm trying to now. She said, I know. That's why I'm still here. That evening, walking back from the lakefront, she took his hand. It was a small thing. Just fingers interlaced, walking beside each other in the early September wind off the lake. But Marcus felt it the way you feel something that comes after a very long absence. Like the first warm day after a brutal winter. Like the first full breath after you've been holding it too long. Vanessa never went to Boston. The position had been filled before the 4 months of conversation were up. She found out on a Tuesday morning in October, checking her email in the kitchen of her small apartment while Coltrane wove around her ankles and the coffee brewed. She called Marcus when she saw it. She told him matter-of-factly. He said, I'm sorry. She said, I'm not. He said, how are you not sorry? That was a significant opportunity. She said, it was. And I'm allowed to have wanted it. And it's gone now. And I'm choosing not to spend my life measuring what might have been if I had been somewhere else when something hard happened. A pause. Then, this is what I'm choosing, Marcus. This conversation. This life. I'm choosing it on purpose, with my eyes open, knowing everything I know. Can you do the same thing? He said, yes. She said, then stop apologizing for Boston. She started a freelance curatorial consultancy in Chicago that October, working with 4 arts organizations on programming and acquisitions. It was smaller than Boston would have been. It was also entirely hers, built with her own contacts, her own expertise, her own reputation. By the following spring, she had 6 clients and a waiting list. Marcus watched this happen with something that he had not felt for a very long time. Genuine admiration, the kind that has no calculation in it, no angle, no secondary agenda. Just the simple recognition of watching someone be good at what they do and knowing you are lucky enough to be close to it. They moved in together in the spring of 2023. Not into the penthouse, that felt too loaded, too much like stepping into a context that had been part of the problem. They found a large apartment in Lincoln Park, the kind of place that felt like somewhere two people had chosen together rather than one person's life that the other had been invited into. Vanessa brought her art books and Coltrane and a collection of small ceramics she had accumulated over the years. Marcus brought almost nothing from the penthouse. He said he wanted to start with only what he actually needed. She said that sounded like a good place to begin. There is one more thing that needs to be told, because it is the part of this story that Marcus himself would say matters most. In the summer of 2023, several months after they had moved in together, Marcus had lunch with Patricia, his ex-wife. They had stayed in loose, occasional contact over the years, a Christmas card once in a while, a brief email when he heard she had moved, the kind of civil, distant communication that two people maintain when a marriage ended without cruelty but also without resolution. She had remarried. She was happy, from what he could tell. They had lunch at a quiet restaurant midway between their respective neighborhoods on a weekday afternoon. He told her what had happened with Vanessa. All of it. He told her because he had been thinking, over the preceding months, about something she had said to him on the way out of their marriage. You never let me in, you observed me, you assessed me, you never actually let me in, and he wanted her to know that he had heard it. That he had understood it eventually, even if not in time to apply the understanding to what they had been. Patricia listened to the whole story. Then she put down her fork and looked at him with the particular expression of a person who has fully moved on but still cares, warmly, at a distance, the way you care about something that happened a long time ago to a person you used to know very well. She said, "I'm glad she stayed, Marcus." He said, "So am I." She said, "You were always capable of this. You just thought capability was something you had to protect instead of something you had to use." He said, "I know that now." She said, "Good." And they finished their lunch, and they walked out into the summer afternoon, and that chapter finally, genuinely, closed. Think about everything that just unfolded in this story. Think about those 37 days. Think about Vanessa cooking in that small kitchen, humming to herself, bringing groceries for a man she believed was suffering, for a man who was watching her from behind a stack of papers. Think about her sitting across from the deadline for a Boston job offer that would have changed her career, and choosing, quietly, without telling him, to turn it down. And then think about the moment she found out the truth. The way she said, "I turned down Boston for a lie." And then she left. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She just picked up her coat and walked out. And here is what I want you to think about right now. If you were Vanessa, what would you have done? Would you have walked out that door and kept walking? Would you have answered the phone 11 days later? Would you have sat on that lakefront bench, 4 months in, and taken his hand? And if you were Marcus, sitting in that rental apartment on the Sunday afternoon when it all finally broke open inside him, what would it have taken for you to pick up the phone and tell the truth? We talk about loyalty in relationships as if it is the only thing that matters. But this story is really about something else. It's about the thing underneath the loyalty. The thing that makes the test necessary in the first place. The fear. And here's the question that I think this story is actually asking: when you love someone, are you loving them, or are you loving the safety of the idea that they might stay? Because those are two very different things. And you can spend your whole life testing the second one without ever truly choosing the first. Marcus Allen learned that. He learned it the hard way. He learned it at the cost of 37 days of constructed grief, one career opportunity that belongs now to someone else in Boston, and 10 days of silence that he says were the loneliest of his life. But he learned it. And then he did the one thing he had never been able to do in 50 years of living: he stopped managing the outcome, and he let someone in. The last thing to tell you is this. In December 2023, Marcus and Vanessa were sitting at home on a quiet Sunday evening. The apartment was warm. Coltrane was asleep on the couch between them. Vanessa was reading and Marcus was working on something on his laptop. And Marcus looked up from the screen for a moment, for no particular reason, the way you look up sometimes when you're comfortable somewhere, and he looked at her. At the way the lamplight fell across her face. At the small, private expression she always had when she was absorbed in something. At the bowl from Seoul that she had insisted on bringing from the penthouse, which was sitting on a shelf across the room from him. And he thought about the night he had walked over to a woman standing at a tall window looking at the rain on the street below, with the expression of someone who had just thought of something good and decided to keep it to herself. He thought about how he had almost not walked over. How he had almost run his normal program, arrive, network, write the check, leave before dessert. And he thought about what all of this would look like if he had run that program. If he had never walked over. Or if, having walked over, he had built a better test instead of eventually telling the truth. He thought about his father, eating cold soup at 3 in the morning in a kitchen that smelled like bread and worn linoleum. He thought about the promise he had made himself standing in that hallway, watching through the gap in the door. He had kept that promise. Money had never had the same power over him that it had over his father. He had made sure of that. But there had been another kind of power, quieter, older, more embedded, that he hadn't thought to protect himself from. The power of his own fear. The fear of being known and found insufficient. The fear that underneath everything, the fund, the penthouse, the watch, the 43rd floor, there was just a boy from the South Side who ate cold soup and wasn't sure he was enough. He had built an empire to answer that question. And then a woman had answered it in a diner on Clark Street, on a cold Thursday night in March, before she even knew she was answering it, by looking at him across a laminated table and saying, "What do you need right now?" He closed his laptop. He looked at her for another moment. She hadn't looked up from her book. He said, "Hey." She said, without looking up, "Hey." He said, "I'm glad you stayed." She turned a page. She said, "I know." Then she looked up. She looked at him with that clear, direct look that had been hers from the beginning. She said, "I'm glad I stayed too." And Coltrane shifted between them on the couch and resettled, and the lamp stayed on, and outside the Lincoln Park apartment the city kept doing what cities do, loud and indifferent and alive, and inside, two people who had found their way to something real sat together in the warm and unremarkable peace of an ordinary Sunday evening. Which is, when you think about it, the whole point. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone in your life, or about the tests we set for the people we love, or about the fear that drives those tests, then I want you to do something right now. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever tested someone you loved? Or have you ever been tested by someone who claimed to love you? And here is the harder question, how did it change things? Because I genuinely believe that the way we answer that question says everything about who we are in the quiet moments when nobody is watching, when there is no performance left and it is just us and the truth of what we feel. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story is the kind of thing you want more of, stories that are real, that are grounded, that ask you questions you keep thinking about long after the video ends, then subscribe right now, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. We have more stories coming. Stories about love and fear and money and the moments that change people forever. Stories that stay with you. This is one of those channels. Stay here. We will see you in the next one.